Hello, and welcome to what I believe is the inaugural episode of Eagle Talk.
Seems like there should be some sort of
You can put that in post, put it like an eagle flying away or something.
Yeah.
That feels a little like extra patriotic. Hello and welcome. My name is Parker Hall. I am joined here today by Barbara Leach. Barbara, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Barbara Leach. I am interim vice president at Kishwaukee College in Malta, Illinois, small rural community college, and I'm excited to be starting my doctoral program and excited to be talking about critical digital pedagogy. It's a great book. You know it's great because it's got a lot of post-it notes. So glad to be here.
My name is Parker Hall. I am an adjunct instructor at NLU in the communications and marketing departments. Very, very much excited to start talking about critical digital pedagogy and also excited to be starting my doctoral program. With that, we're going to dive right in. So for those of you who are joining us to learn specifically about critical digital pedagogy, first thing you're probably thinking, what is critical digital pedagogy? There's a lot to unpack there, right? Before I kind of get into a couple of things that we wanted to highlight, Barbara, I'm curious if you're talking to a colleague, right? We've been really spending a lot of time in this book and in this literature. How are you defining critical digital pedagogy?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know that we're having too many of these conversations, and I think that's what really made me excited about this book. And when you see the book, if you get a chance to pick it up, it's very distinct chapters on very distinct topics, but all around this general theme. And so I think what I love about this book is it's got talking points for anyone. There's a chapter for librarians. There's a chapter for instructional designers. Like there's a little bit of everything. So I wish I could tell you what a good definition is, because I don't even think I have a clear definition, because critical, as you're going to talk about, digital, critical, and pedagogy are all kind of handled separately in the education world.
Yeah.
And putting them all together is really a unique thing that I've been excited to hear more about.
Yeah, I really appreciate and sort of the introducing chapters of the book. We talk about how, there are three words. There's critical, there's digital, and there's pedagogy. And you're right, we do talk about them separately in the education world. And I appreciate that when we're thinking about critical digital pedagogy, we need to be mindful of where our brains kind of go to. The focus first, right? For me, it's digital. And I think that's true for a lot of people.
Especially during COVID times.
Absolutely.
I think it went straight to digital.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I think for me that was really interesting to wrestle with was thinking about how critical and pedagogy fit into our digital practices, right? And critical, not just critical thinking, but I think one of the terms that some of the editors use is mission critical. It's important. It's so critical, not just, obviously COVID has really accelerated the use of digital tools and digital practices, but even before then, right, our world is accelerating so quickly. But then also pedagogy, which often has a sort of tie to just K-12 or even just primary education, right? We think of pedagogy as what are we doing with children and like learning as children. But, I think that does a disservice to how we're reflecting on our teaching practices and higher education, right? Pedagogy matters in all forms of learning. One thing that I wanted to sort of highlight was that the one thing that's really interesting about this book is we're talking about critical digital pedagogy, but there really is no clear definition, because critical digital pedagogy is more about the questions we ask.
Yes.
And the solutions we find, right?
Or that we're asking questions. And I think that is important, because I think especially during pandemic times, we've just been looking for answers, solutions. How do we solve, here's X problem, how do we fix it?
Mm-hmm.
And not always questioning, did we choose the right way to fix it, or is there a different way to fix it? So I think you're spot on there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's asking those questions, right? And it becomes this, hopefully, a cyclical process of practice, reflect, practice, and this idea that we are constantly asking questions about what's working, what's not, who is at the table, who is not, how are these spaces serving our students, who are they not serving well, right? And it is that constant process of asking questions and being okay, I think, with sometimes not finding an answer right away.
Or finding an answer that did not work. And then being okay starting over again. I think a lot of times we have that a little bit of analysis paralysis, where if I try it and this doesn't work, have I invested all this time and energy into something and now I have to start over again? And I think it's like the rough draft of a speech in your communication classes or in any writing assignment, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to not figure it out the first time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like if there's something that like a silver lining to the pandemic is that we've had a lot of time and space to take pause, and to, I think, get a little bit comfortable with being uncomfortable. And I think we see a lot of that just sort of in the things that are talked about in this book, which I absolutely love.
Agreed.
Yeah. So if you're taking anything away from the sort of like, how do we define critical digital pedagogy? It's that there really is not a clear definition. It's how we engage in digital spaces, how we use digital tools, and how we're critically engaging those in ways that we are approaching pedagogy and ways of teaching and learning. So now that we've sort of gone through trying to define, right, what critical digital pedagogy is, why do we need to talk about it?
Well, and I know you're going to mention this more, and our article that we also attached with this, it's all about the transformation, right? And I actually think there's a lot of silver linings to the pandemic from the education standpoint. I hope that's not a snippet that somehow ends up in a meme somewhere, but um, I think we've spent a lot of time looking at a lot of new tools and trying things. And now as we're coming out, what's next? So it's really time to think about the things we've implemented and the pedagogy that we're using and whether or not it's something we want to sustain or we should.
Yeah. On top of that, like we already mentioned or kind of hinted at, the world is changing. It has been changing. This is the point in history, human history, where culture and work and relationships and communications are changing faster than at any point in human history. And that was true before 2020. And I think it's even more true now. I think we're working within a world, and particularly with higher education, a system that is sometimes slow to change.
Sometimes. You're being very generous there. I was thinking molasses light, but that's okay.
Yeah, that's valid. I'm using what my friends refer to as a British understatement. So, right, like higher education, change is hard, and there's a lot of bureaucracy, there's a lot of layers, there's a lot of moving pieces. I think what we're finding both, in our experiences, right, and the administrative side and then the instructional side, as well as just like being a human in the world right now, we don't have the privilege of taking a lot of time on these changes, right? Because just as we're talking with our students and preparing them for the work world for me when I was starting in 2015 is different than it is now, right? And that's not that long. And there's so much difference, right? And so, as the world is changing and as how we use digital tools, digital spaces is just changing, I think, faster than we have yet to catch up to just cognitively, we need to be talking about these practices. We need to be talking about these things because that world is changing so quickly, right? You already hit on the COVID-19 piece and how that sort of hit that fast forward button on those changes. As our digitally connected world has expanded our access to wider parts of the world and more people and experiences, I think it's also created blind spots.
For sure.
And there's so many ways, right? I think in my own experience, I'm teaching juniors and seniors in college, and because we're using the digital tools every day, I'm assuming that every single student that comes to my classroom is already a digital native, right? And what I'm finding is that's not true.
No, I've been having conversations with faculty at my college, and they're finding that the students are very astute at certain digital tools, like Facebook or Instagram or any of those, but
right.
They're struggling to know how to use a flash drive or to upload a file or to do some of those basics. So we're actually looking to do some orientations, much like NLU does, which I think were great, to here's how you do this, here's how you do this, to help them with their digital literacy. We're looking to add a digital literacy specialist in our library to help them understand how to use Word, because they're just not, I think the assumption I had was the same assumption you had. And I think a lot of people, so many people have had that assumption that nobody's teaching them.
Yeah.
Skills. They just assume they know it.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's because there's this aspect of, when tech was becoming, when people started having computers in their homes, right? When I was growing up, we got a computer when I was in early elementary, and tech wasn't great. Like you had to troubleshoot, you had to sometimes just really pray that something would work. And like, if something broke, you were like, I don't know.
I gotta tell you, when I'm older than you, so this is going to date me, but I had an Apple IIe in my dorm, my sophomore year of college, and it was the big thing. And it was the black screen with the green type and the giant 5-inch floppy
Yeah.
disks that you just prayed that you didn't
Yes.
run them through a demagnetizer or something with. So
Yes.
yeah, you did have to do a lot of it yourself. You had to
Yeah.
become a little bit of a computer person in order to
Mhm.
function. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think alongside that, like not only were you having to problem solve a little bit more at home on your own because just tech wasn't inherently user friendly, but also I think we were placing more emphasis on training people to use it in
Yeah,
school, in the workplace, right? If a
for sure.
workplace wanted to transition to a digital space, they had to train people to use that. It was, we were all learning together. Whereas now for us, we see, our phones, right? And we're like, oh, this is great. It's super easy, very user friendly.
Yeah.
But I think what we're missing, and what maybe we have accidentally, as an entire culture, as an education system, what we've done is we've sort of taken our experience and go, well, this is easier compared to, but that doesn't mean that it is instinctual. It doesn't
Great
mean,
point. Yeah, that's a
yeah.
really good point. We just assume that it's so much better. Like back in my day, kind of vibe that I think we have forgotten to do a little bit of that. And I also think we have lost a little bit of how students engage with technology on their day-to-day basis. And
Mm,
the technology that they're using is just very different than the interaction they're needing to do in the education space. And
right.
those are two distinct things that need to be discussed with students.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a really interesting analogy that I encountered with this is that just because you might grow up with a bookshelf and books in your home doesn't mean you know how to read without being taught.
That's great.
And like when we're little and we're reading books, there's pictures and we might start to pick up on things, but if we're not taught how to critically encounter literature, we're not going to. And I think the same is true of, like you said, we might be using things like Facebook and social media and things that are more entertainment or connection based, but if we're not taught how to be thoughtful digital citizens,
Right.
and then beyond that, just the tools extending to, like you said, education, right? There's not a natural thing. It's not like learning how to walk. People who've grown up with it are still learning how to engage with these things
I
better.
don't think D2L is just an intuitive world where students are excited and engaged.
What's interesting, you say that, and I think it depends on the student. And I think it depends on, this is like a new thing that I've kind of been thinking about. And I think reading this book highlighted a lot of these things for me. For those of us who might feel a little more at home problem solving in a digital space because of having to like grow alongside tech, I think a lot of us have a more intuitive sense of understanding where we are in a digital space and navigating, thinking of it kind of like architecture, right? But it's in a digital space. And I found that as I'm talking to some of the students that aren't as excited about being engaged on D2L, it's because they're not thinking of it as an environment. They're thinking of
Mm,
it as just a tool,
good tool. Yeah.
you know? And I don't know where that breaks down, if that is just the generational difference, if it's the assumption that these things are easy or that they are intuitive. Um,
I think there's also some messaging that we can do
mm,
as faculty
yeah,
to talk about this as like, here's your home for this class. Like
yeah,
here is not just here's where you click on this button to get to this, but
right.
this is where you find all things to be helpful and to get you to be
Mhm.
successful in this class. And
Yeah,
so I think you're right. I think faculty use it in so many different ways.
yeah.
Students engage differently in every class that they're in, and it's not until they get to one of those faculty, I'm guessing you're one of those, that that really treats it like an environment, that
Yeah,
they get, oh, this is not just button clicking in a program. This is so much more that will help me.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that sort of, again, sort of builds on what we've already been talking about, right? Like when we recognize that we have these blind spots, I think we can start having those conversations, right? Because I know in my own experience, when I have a student texting me because they can't figure out how to upload a document to an assignment, before I was more flabbergasted and caught off guard. Again, that sort of like not understanding where that disconnect is. Whereas now it's turned into more of a preemptive conversation. It's
Yeah.
turned into more of, how do you navigate D2L? Tell me how you experience each classroom in an online space. And it's bizarre hearing some of those. And it's still early. Like just since reading this book, I've started kind of like, when I have the opportunity, asking these questions and examining how I'm utilizing the space and trying to figure out, where can I better communicate how I want students to use it, rather than just assuming that they will use it in a way that I am.
Yeah. And I liked what you said about the preemptive, like
Mhm.
to get out ahead of it. And the more that we can message in advance, the more it also makes them feel comfortable talking to
Mhm.
you and asking those questions
Yeah.
when they're struggling.
Yeah. Now that we've taken some time to define critical digital pedagogy and why this is something that's worth talking about in your institution, in your departments, in your own personal experiences with colleagues and with your students, let's take a moment to reflect on how you're feeling, what you're thinking right now, on whether or not you feel that these questions and this critical digital pedagogy already align with your current pedagogical practices. So let's move on then to part 2 and talking about the practices and best practice in implementing tech in higher education. All right. So before we even get into some best practices, which I know that can be the things that we want, you're like, just tell me what to do, right? I just want to know what to try, how to make things better, what's a best practice that I can implement. We kind of have some. I like to think of them as personal ground rules, I guess, and how we are implementing sort of changes in our own practices. And I think the first one, and I think this, I love how this permeates throughout this book, is be kind to yourself, to your students, to your faculty, to your admin. And kindness looks like a lot of things, right? Like I'm curious how you've sort of been implementing that in your own practice, Barbara.
Yeah, I think we're actually working on this a lot at our institution because as email has become such a more standard way of communicating, as face-to-face is not as face-to-face as it used to be.
Mhm.
We've been working a lot on talking through like tone and even tone in your emails and picking up the phone and making a call instead of
Mm.
sending out another email, and try and assume that everybody is trying to do their best.
Mhm.
And I think those are the messages that we keep going back on. Like, it's not what you say, it's how you say it.
Mm.
And then let's not assume that everybody's out to make your life harder.
Yeah. Yeah. So definitely, inserting that empathy into your daily
Yes,
practice.
100%. And
Yeah.
just taking the time to try and understand the person's point of view
Mm.
instead of just reading a quick email and going, well, they sounded like they were being rude, kind of thing. So
Right.
then we pick up the phone and just ask the questions. And
Yeah,
how about you?
absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the things that there are sort of two practices that I am implementing. One is for myself, which is I don't have to change everything overnight.
Oh,
you know I don't have to start over.
a hard one.
It is. And what's funny is it's something that I think I've been really practicing and trying to keep in mind, and then to have that sort of affirmed by Kate Denial, who I believe actually writes about a pedagogy of kindness in this book, and I recently spoke at an NLU professional development session, and she shared this, and I didn't realize that was a part of being kind to myself, even though it was something that I've been practicing. And, the reason she sort of really drove that home was that, one, you don't have to change everything overnight. Two, it's exhausting. And three, you're not leaving room for that reflection that you need to really monitor how change is working for you, working for your students, working for your department or whatever, right? And it's just because you learn something that's new and it's really exciting, you don't have to just like throw everything away and start new, because that's not kind to you. It's not kind to anybody, right?
Yeah, I just finished reading it's pretty popular right now called Think Again by
Mm,
Adam Grant.
yeah.
And it's about taking that time to really
Mm,
say, okay, well, that's really cool. And instead of starting a task force or a committee or sending out an email saying, guess what, we're implementing this, take
right.
that time and really critically assess it. Is this something
Mm,
that could work for us? How could it work for us? I think in our busy schedules, it's hard to slow down and just think about things.
yeah.
Like sometimes I just find myself saying, I wish I just had like an hour to just think about stuff
Yes.
instead of doing stuff. So
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
yeah, but I never thought of it as being kind to yourself. But that is that inner tension, right?
Yeah.
That treadmill, I must get it done, must get it done, must get it done. But then thinking, just want to sit for a minute
Yeah.
and think about it. So yeah, I did like how that permeated throughout this entire book. That
Mm-hmm.
idea of we're going to do the best we can. We're going to be reflective. We're going to think
Mm-hmm.
about it, but we're going to treat everybody kindly.
Yeah. And then they sort of like other sort of piece of kindness that are, pedagogy of kindness that's really permeating my work in the last year or so, and even more so now. I think this book really lit a fire under me to share this with my colleagues. I have a newer policy in my classroom that I've been trying out. I've just started, collecting some data just to see if it's making an impact. And it's an unlimited resubmission policy where, and this part of this came out of COVID, right? Because life is happening. And I wanted students to feel like, it almost started because I had a couple students asking me if they could submit a draft version and then submit their final version, a couple hours later. And the answer was always yes. And it was almost because they felt like they needed to show me that they were working on it.
Right.
Right. But then that sort of developed into this sort of, really thinking through, how do we learn, right? How do we learn in the workplace? I don't submit something to my boss and she's like, okay, well, that's a C-level work, next project. It's, here you go, maybe make some changes and try again. This isn't done yet.
We just submitted a document for an awards thing, and it went through 7 drafts.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And if I turned in the first draft and thought that was done, I would be a sad person.
Right.
I'd be disappointed in myself all the time. So
yeah.
You're right. We have so many expectations for students. And I think a lot of them are built on old models, or how we learned, or how we were taught. That's why teacher training and higher ed is so important of a topic to me, because thinking about why are we doing the things we're doing. And I think your unlimited submission thing is great. Everybody's worried that people are going to take advantage of it, or they're worried that students are going to do X, Y, or Z. Or when we talk about some of the concerns about tech, they're worried they're going to cheat. So what can we do to stop them and police them, instead of what if we design things differently? So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, it's been a fun experience, and I'm loving watching students almost get used to the fact that they can try, and it's not the end of the world if they have to fix a couple things. But that brings me into the second sort of point of this process, which is recognizing that our students have been living and learning in the current system for 12 plus years.
Yep.
And as educators, we've been in it longer on both sides, right? As the learner and the educator. And what that means is that no matter how many times I tell some students that they can resubmit and there will be no long-lasting effect on their final grade if they didn't do great the first time around, some of them don't believe me.
Yep. It can't be true.
Right? It's so funny, because when I had my midterm check-ins, I had probably 3 or 4 students, when I asked them how the class was going, they answered along the lines of, it's good, it's weird, I still don't believe you when you say I can keep resubmitting. And so, when we're making these changes in our classrooms, right, and in our institutions, even when you make the change, it's going to take time for people to catch up and to really accept that things are different, right?
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
Have you had any pushback from your colleagues on that policy? Because we have in every institution there's the rigor police, and I'm sure you have the same thing, right? And so is this somehow like letting students off the hook, or dumbing down your policies? And
So what's interesting, so my director, when I shared this with her, she was super intrigued and was like, okay, let me know how it goes. And then when I showed her some of the results, where I have students that are, they're starting with D level work, and it's their final draft is an A. And I mean an actual A. It's not like, oh, good job, you did more effort. It's actually
they didn't get a grade up for every time they resubmitted.
Right. No, absolutely not. And there's actual improvement. And then talking to one of our student success coaches, he noticed, he's like, I can see just in like the feedback and in the grade progression, there's actual improvement. And so I think they're actually sort of on board with this, because it's not lowering rigor. I think it's actually increasing it. Whereas the little kickback I have had is from a couple of colleagues that are instructors as well. And I think their questions are, how much extra work, right? And that's a fair question, because many of us are adjuncts, right? Many of them are teaching at several institutions. It's a lot of work, right? And that's a whole other podcast talking about.
And I think that's part of why people can tend to get a little rigid in their assignments and their grading, because they're trying to keep up. I mean, I taught high school for like 15 years. It is a constant deluge of paperwork. Constant deluge. So I totally get it. I totally
Hmm.
get looking for things that make life a little easier.
Yeah,
So I do understand
absolutely.
the concern.
Yeah. And I think I would be lying if I said it hasn't given me more work.
Sure.
But for me, it's been worth it, because even though in the first few weeks, it's a lot of extra work. But what I'm noticing is those students who are submitting D and C level work the first time around, by midterm, they're
That's what I was
starting with
wondering.
A level work.
That's what I was wondering, if they're starting to
Yeah.
get I often thought about the English papers that I was handing back
Mm,
that I had taken so much care and time to do feedback on.
yeah,
But if it was the final draft, all they cared about was their grade at that.
exactly.
You have made it formative
Hmm.
learning and
Hmm.
assessment instead of summative, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah. And it's, yeah, it is that extra work. But I think in the end, it almost makes it a little bit less work, because instead of constantly having to give all that robust feedback and things to like improve on, I'm just blown away and able to just be like, this is amazing. This is exactly what I'm looking for. Here's a couple extra things you might be interested in looking at. There's not really much additional room for, editing or changes. And so my actual grading time, I think by midterm, is less than what it would have been.
Sounds like you have a conference presentation in you.
I'm working on it. I'm thinking about it. So that's a whole thing. But yeah, it's interesting. So yeah, there's kickback, but I think part of it does feed back into that. This is all we know.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's just have the conversation. And just because somebody doesn't want to implement this in their classroom, I'm not hurt. Like, my feelings aren't hurt. Like, do I think it's worth it? Yes. But I recognize that it's going to take time. And that's okay.
Looking back at what we were talking about, you said some practices, and the book did talk about quite a few of those.
Yeah.
Did you want to share some of those, what you thought about some of the ones in the book, and whether or not you've tried any of those? I've tried one or two of these.
I'm excited to hear what you tried. Yeah. So of those practices, and there's so many that the book goes into, one that I've already used, which is think, pair, share, which is so great. I love it. It was one of the first tools that somebody sort of taught me about when I was first learning to teach. And it's wonderful because, and I didn't even realize how important it really is until there's a quote from Kathy Davidson, who wrote the article, Why Start with Pedagogy, in the book. And she says, hearing your own voice in a classroom and witnessing being heard is the beginning of taking responsibility for your own learning. And with Think, Pair, Share, even if they're not shouting out to the class, they're still talking with a neighbor or with a couple of
Yep.
people, and yeah, I love Think, Pair, Share. It's amazing. I still use it. I use it almost every week.
It works in elementary school, it works in junior high, it works in high school, it works in
Yeah.
higher ed, it works
Yep.
in faculty development.
Yeah.
People like to have the opportunity to share their thoughts, and it is a low pressure, a low threat
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of situation.
The other one that I've really loved and actually just recently started implementing is the exit ticket. I went and I found on Amazon this like long, it's like 1,000 little, they're small index cards and they're different colors. And I hand them out. And essentially what you do is you ask your students at the end of class, take the last 3 minutes to write a question that is still on their mind.
Yep.
And I have been blown away by just the rich thought processes that are going on and that they're not sharing out loud, which has been an interesting thing to kind of wrestle with. And it's given me some new ammunition to get them thinking and talking a little bit more in class, which has been a lot of fun. So it's super, super easy.
Yeah, I used to then use those exit tickets as my kind of, well, back in K-12, they call them bell ringers, but
Okay.
that way to introduce the class for the day, like, hey, I was reading through those. You guys had great questions.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like maybe I didn't touch enough on this particular topic. And
Mm-hmm.
also somebody had this really cool question. I'd like to start the day with that. So I thought I love those. It also helped me be more reflective because
Mm-hmm.
I don't know about you, but sometimes I was teaching the same lecture or the same lesson over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I was doing a fabulous job, but maybe I was shortchanging one class or the other. So those questions at the end of the day, at the end of the class, really helped me say, oh, I totally missed that with this class, or I need to go back and hit that a little harder. So
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I've sort of just, I love these two tools, but I think what's funny is we started with two tools that are very low tech.
so low tech. Yeah.
And that's okay. And I think that's what's really cool about critical digital pedagogy is it's, we're asking the questions, when is tech useful? When is it not? Right?
Yeah. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later when we talk about some of the dangers
Yeah.
of tech, but it doesn't always have to be tech. I
Yeah.
think that is the takeaway that I keep wanting to share with people. They always want the next new tool and the exciting thing, and it doesn't always have to be tech. It can be no cards. Like it
Yeah.
can be as simple as no cards.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Kind of moving on from that, right, is, like, don't just use tech for tech's sake, but find ways to make tech work for you. Some of the things that I haven't gotten to try yet, but I really, I love the idea of using Twitter chats.
Yeah, I was reading about that in the book.
Yeah, this idea that one of the ways that one of the authors used it was they had the introverts stay back on their computers on the chat, using a certain hashtag that they were using for whatever they were doing, and they had the extroverts volunteer, or at least some of the extroverts, probably not all of them, to run around campus and interview people about perceptions of whatever they were talking about.
Yeah.
And so you had this really interesting dynamic of finding ways for different learners to engage in the same thing. So, finding ways to use the tools that our students are already active on. The amount of my students that have told me that they use Snapchat to connect with their coworkers and their bosses. That was the moment when I realized I am no longer part of the cool generation on the internet.
I was going to say, there's no way my boss is wanting me to snap.
Right.
Sometimes I send a whimsical Bitmoji, but that's about as far as I'll go.
Right, exactly. And so I started thinking, I'm like, okay, I have avoided Snapchat somehow. And now I'm thinking, how can I implement this in a classroom? There's a lot of ethical and data practices that we'll talk about a little bit about how to think through that critically. But, thinking about not just the learning management systems, D2L, Brightspace, Blackboard, they're great. They're great. Zoom, right? Yeah. So, how do we make tech work for us, and how do we bring the humanity into the ones and zeros that create all of these tools, right? So I think when we're thinking about best practices, right, pay attention to the tools you're using, right? And we're going to talk about shortly, but I think it's important that we avoid a universal solution.
Yes.
And I think, like you said, Zoom has been that universal solution because of the pandemic. And I'm not sure it's always the best, right?
I feel like it's one of those tools that's going to be hard to come back from. For some people, it has become the easiest form of communication. They're figuring out they can do their work differently. They're figuring out their world can look differently. But at the same time, it's face-to-face, but it's not face-to-face.
Right.
So I think it's going to be hard to say, let's not use Zoom as much. I'm living in that tricky world right now where some of my meetings are face-to-face and some are Zoom, and I'm running back and forth.
Interesting.
So it's that hard thing now of we're in this limbo of Zoom. So it'll be interesting to see how much we use it moving forward.
It will be, yeah. And I think I've noticed that in these scenarios where I'm only using Zoom sparingly, so for the class that we're taking right now, we've had synchronous options on Zoom where we're normally 100% online. And in that case, Zoom is amazing. Yes. It's a nice break, right? But I think if we were only using Zoom, that might get a little bit exhausting quickly. I see it with my students who are now, we're doing hybrid. I'm teaching 2 in person and 1 on Zoom, and the engagement, I feel like, has almost gone down because they're getting that face-to-face. And then they remember come Thursday morning, I have to log on to Zoom.
Yeah, we were able to build in, it's a very small percentage of our classes this semester, but we built a couple flex classrooms. And I don't know if NLU is doing that at all, but so students can choose to come to campus and take their class face-to-face, or they can Zoom in synchronously. And I think that's going to be very telling for us, how many of our students are showing up and how many aren't, because, we've surveyed our students and they all said, I want to be back on campus, but they enrolled in online classes. That's what all the research is showing too. Everybody thought students wanted to be back face-to-face, but they're not doing that when they register because life is different.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting world to plan for, and what's best for the students versus what the students choose.
Yeah. So I think, when we're thinking about best practices, there are lots of little things. You can do think, pair, share, you can do the exit ticket, you can use a Twitter chat, you can find ways to maybe not use Zoom as often, right? Get a little creative, use Jamboard, and, there's always different sorts of ways we can engage online. But I think, with your point about surveying students, I think at the end of the day, student agency matters.
Yep.
Right. As long as we are okay and comfortable with being creative and asking questions, but also making sure our students have a seat at that table when we're making these decisions, I think we'll be all right. So with that, I think we can move on to our next sort of reflection point. Take some time to pause and reflect on how are you feeling about this pedagogical approach right now? What barriers do you see in implementing these practices, these changes in your own practice? And what strategies are you excited to try?
So our next section talks about what are some of the concerns or ramifications of technology using in higher ed. And I know Parker and I have already kind of touched on some of these with Zoom fatigue and those kinds of things, but the author brought up some stuff. Several of the authors brought up things that both Parker and I, the first time we met, were like, oh no, I never thought about that, or I should have been thinking about that. So, but we're going to do better now that we know better. So I think one of my favorite quotes is critical digital pedagogy demands we approach our tools and technologies always with one eyebrow raised. So with that skeptical kind of vibe, and several of the chapters talked about this, the fact that technology in higher education has moved forward at such a rapid rate. I think I read somewhere technology has leapfrogged 10 years during COVID. The authors expressed a lot of concern that we as institutions spent a lot of time and money, frankly. Our tech budget went through the roof during this time, and I'm sure most others did as well, trying to figure out how do we do things online? How do we do things differently? But I'm not sure we always investigated the whether or not those new technologies were positive and ethical and unbiased. And I think that was really a key point that I took away from this book. And one of those tools they talked about, chapter 4, was Turnitin and plagiarism software. I've used it as an instructor. I've approved of it as an administrator at my institution. I have been in full support of tools such as Turnitin. And what this book really talked about was the fact that we are basically asking students to sign away their intellectual property when we ask them to sign away, to sign and agree to use Turnitin. They upload their content to this tool, but this tool is also taking their content and using it to make its own algorithms and tools better, and then selling it back to the institution where the students are forced to use it. And they call it a bait and switch, that students turn in this paper because they have to, but then they're basically saying, okay, this paper is now out there for you to use. I know you found some of that disturbing too, Parker.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that I hadn't even really thought about in that way. And yet, as somebody who teaches and works with social media, one of the big justice things is how content creators are paid fairly by the platforms that they are creating on. And so if we're having these conversations on, people who are putting their data on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok, on YouTube, and how are the platforms being good stewards of that ad revenue that's made on that content, right? And if we're, a bit outraged, and by a bit, I mean, we are outraged usually as content creators when we feel taken advantage of, our data, our intellectual property is taken advantage of. And yet this is the first time that I've even really thought about that.
And we don't even give them a choice. You as a content creator have the right to say, I'm just not going to use that platform. But we require the students to use a platform and give them no choice. It is literally their grade, right? If they don't use it. So yeah, it really got me thinking. And then they also talked a lot about just the plagiarism software itself. Like, why do we feel the need to police students in that way? And the fact that we're kind of creating an automatic hostile environment. Like you talked about the multiple submissions. Have you used Turnitin as a student?
As a student, yeah.
Yeah, and so you sit there and you wait, you submit it and you wait to see what the percentage is. And is it going to come back as that I plagiarized something that I didn't? And so sometimes the authors talked about supplanting good teaching with the use of inferior technology. And so why, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more with some of these others, but why not use better assessments and better assignments and better tools that don't require you to police your students in that way?
Yeah, I mean, and this is one of those instances where my question is, do we need a technological solution? As an instructor, I would hope that I can trust my gut when I'm reading through my students' papers and go, that's not your voice. That's very, and like my favorite is when like it's a different font.
Yeah, and my favorite was the blue box was still there. You know, when you copy and paste and it won't let you. And I'm like, why is this one page just blue? And the
Right.
student said, well, I was just trying something to make it look nice. And I'm like, no, I didn't need a tool to tell me that. So
Right. And if ever I'm in doubt, I'll copy the section that feels off. I'll put it into Google, and sure enough, there's
yeah,
the article or the blog or whatever. And then what it does is when I'm doing that without a little number or a little flag, that automatically goes to the plagiarism office, which in some universities is an automatic suspension or
yeah,
expulsion.
yeah,
Where for me, it needs to turn into a teaching moment, because and some of the research that I'm not sure if it pops up in this book, but talking about how academic writing is a culture in and of itself. For students that are first generation students, for many of them, the first time that they're encountering how do I do APA? How do I do MLA? Why am I
yep,
doing MLA in this class and APA in this class,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And I had a student this week texting me about in-text citations. I was so glad that they were asking. And this is a junior. And so, but they're also computer science. So a lot of what they're doing is very different, right? Where they're taking a writing class with me. And so this is almost like a refresher. And they're like, oh, it's been a minute since I've had to and we're turning it in, like you said, it turns it into a hostile environment. It turns it into the assumption that our students are going to plagiarize, they're stealing,
yep,
when instead we flip it to our students are learning. And how
yeah,
do we turn that into a teachable moment? And if we have something like unlimited resubmissions, then we can show them how to properly use that source in a way that is their own, and how to
yeah.
properly attribute it rather than saying, why are you cheating?
Or you cheated,
Yeah. Yeah. Or
fail.
just saying you cheated.
Yeah, you cheated, you fail. So
Mm,
the authors talked about in the book, there's this really interesting tool. This is talking about like critically evaluating your digital tools and
mhm,
about being good consumers of it. And I don't
mm.
know about you, but when I looked at these questions, it never occurred to me to ask like, who owns this? Who
Yeah.
is the person? Like, what are their politics? Does that matter? How does it market itself? Like, what does it say it does versus what it actually does? What are the terms of service? Because that's where, in Turnitin, students are signing away their intellectual freedom. How does the design of the tool influence what we might do with it? Like, are we in some cases using the tool to guide our educational pedagogy and our lesson planning? Like, are you making the choices and assignments based on whether this tool will effectively grade it for you? And so
Oh.
there's all sorts of stuff out there online about like different rubrics to critically evaluate. The one that really threw me is like, does it do what it says it does? As a lot of us were working through COVID trying to figure it out, we needed to do X. This says it does. Okay, implement. And now what? We were trying to
Right.
fix a problem before we really asked what the problem was. So the authors encourage students to fight back and actively like consider writing letters and demanding not to have to use Turnitin. So it'll be interesting to see if students, pay enough attention to it. And do they even realize it? Like if us as educators didn't realize, then how do we expect students to know that? So it's really up to us to be good stewards of the technology.
It's up to us to be those good stewards, and I think it's also going to depend on your discipline. But in my classes where my students are using tech, I find myself sort of feeling like I need to be responsible for helping them even know what questions to ask,
Yeah.
because how are they going to know, right?
Yeah. Well, and then another tool they talked about that, again, I have encouraged during COVID is test proctoring software. They had a lot to say in this book about discriminatory practices. I mean,
Yeah.
straight up discriminating against anyone who is not able-bodied, neurotypical, and white,
Yeah.
frankly. We've had students start to complain a little bit about it. And it's another one of those tools that we said, okay, it's COVID. Students can't come in and take their tests. What's out there? Somebody said, we do that. And we said, okay, sounds like a good plan. But, if you look at algorithm type software
Mm,
that's out there for this, facial recognition software is wildly inaccurate. Students of color not being recognizable on the screen,
yeah.
students who have facial tics being flagged for cheating because they maybe make body movements that are outside
Yeah.
the norm. It was really very disheartening to read, and probably the thing that I'm going to need to be having the most conversations with at my institution,
Yeah.
because as we move out of COVID, people really have liked it because they don't have to use class time.
I know you started having a couple of those conversations at your institution. What has that response been like?
Not very positive, frankly, because I don't know why, but it is a whole rethink, right? If you're worried about cheating, again, it's the policing and the expectation that your students are going to cheat. But then design assessments that include personal experiences, that include applications of knowledge in a variety of different ways,
Yeah.
so that you can get at whether the student really knows it or not. I love this
Mhm.
idea that you told me about with NLU not using exams, because I think we are very exam heavy still at
Mhm.
my institution, and it's a lot of summative assessment. So it's big ticket tests, high stakes, and we're using this tool that I know has flagged students for cheating who I don't think are cheating, and it is such a scary thing. And then they also talked about privacy, which had never occurred to me. The proctors from these companies, they see into students' homes. They're often recorded, and faculty can see students in their homes. And what kind of privacy issues are we talking about? I mean, they talked about the worst case scenario of like stalkers and things like that. They
Yeah.
even talked about some of these tools carry some metadata on
Mhm.
location of where the test is being taken. So
Right.
this was a hard one for me. It was a really hard chapter for me.
Yeah, same, absolutely. Because again, the hope is that you don't have faculty who are going to their students' homes,
Of course. Or
but
proctor.
also, or proctors, right? But again, students are required to use these or fail. Not only is that, taking away student voice, student choice, right? But beyond that, you really hit at home the point where these systems are not built for all bodies. My fiance has had to use, these proctoring services to get certifications for work. It's frustrating because while he is white and male, he is neurodivergent and really needs to fidget every now and again, as well as has a seizure disorder. And our dog is an alert dog and she knows how to open the office door. And so there's that fear of, if she needs to alert him,
Right.
is the proctor going to end the exam? And if it's a human proctor and he's able to tell them, he's had some positive experiences with that, but he's had some proctors that it's just the algorithm, it's automated, and there are no refunds, and these are several hundreds of dollars to take each time. And so there's a justice issue. There's so many things here that it solves one problem, but it creates so many more.
But like we have students who like are sitting in their bathrooms taking these tests because it's the best spot where they don't think they'll get disturbed because they're so worried. And then you think about like you're so worried about movement. And I think about people who have stress related tic disorders and things like that. And just being in a test itself causes those kinds of things.
Right.
But then to add the pressure of they're going to think I cheat if I look away too many times or if I make a hand gesture. I think it is the tool from this book that really disturbed me the most, and that I need to. You talked about not having to fix everything right away, but I think this is one of those things I have to address right away.
Yeah, it's a little disheartening to hear that you haven't had the best response so far, but yeah, I really hope that you can move this conversation and move
I
to
think we will. I think
yeah.
we have a lot of people who care very much about their students, and I think some of it is they just don't know. I'm ashamed to say I didn't know, but now I do. So now I have to do something with it. And while we're talking about, people with disability related concerns, the last chapter I wanted to talk about was the importance of making disability part of the discussion when you're
Mhm.
designing in course methodology. And
Yes.
my takeaway quote from that was, too often we react to diversity instead of planning for it.
Yeah.
Here's what everybody else does. And then
Mhm.
whoever doesn't fit in will figure out a way to do it. And
Yeah.
one of the examples that the author talks about is there is this trend of people going to a digital free classroom, a screen free classroom idea, where students are too distracted by having all their computer screens and iPads and things, and that they learn better by writing physical notes and things.
Mm.
But the author said, that's great, except what about the student who can't physically write? What about the student who needs tech tools in order to be successful in the class? And this idea that we are actually like causing more problems by trying to solve problems. So we're trying to solve distraction problems by taking away all their distractions, but then you're taking away the very tools that help students be successful in the class. It was a really interesting chapter, and I think sums up so many issues that we deal with every day in higher ed. How do we fix X? We'll do this. Well, but then this causes like it's this snowball effect. And what did you think about that chapter?
Absolutely loved it. I think it really highlighted for me some things that I think I've already been trying to do and found new ways to just be better. One thing that I loved about that chapter was this idea that accommodations are useful and they're important, but they often sort of force students to come out, as far as their needs.
Yeah.
And their learning disabilities or neurodivergencies and things like that. While it's nice to know who in my class has ADA accommodations, I've never had to adjust my practice because what they need is always something that is accessible and welcome in my classroom, right? Everybody is welcome to extensions and what now with the resubmissions, right? So, whenever I'm starting a class, I tell my students, you don't have to tell me why you need an extension. You are more than welcome to. I want to be able to, have that relationship, right? But then I also say, if you are struggling to not just say I need an extension and you feel like you need to add an excuse, it's not an excuse. There's reasons. You're a human. I don't care if it's I worked too late tonight and I'm exhausted, or my kid is screaming and I haven't been able to work on this paper, or I'm doing this, this video and I wanted to do it with a friend and they keep rescheduling. I don't care as long as I know that you're working on it or you have a plan and I know where I can support you. Those are available to everybody, which is super nice because my students that have accommodations for, consideration for deadlines, they don't have to worry about me potentially telling them no.
You said something about that you're already doing things that work for everybody. And that is the thing. Like if you're designing your class where you are not reacting, but you're planning for everybody. It reminds me of a lot of the DEI work we're trying to do at my institution, where people want to do like a separate thing for certain populations of students, but isn't it best practice for everybody? If you can make this institutional in how you roll something out, it's going to be good for everybody. Everybody's going to do better. So I love what you said. And I love what you said about the coming out idea, because they said, well, one of the instructors said if they need to use it because they have a accommodation, well, they can. But then bing, bing, like you're pointing arrows at the one student and everybody's going to be like, how come they get to use their iPad? Coming out of K-12, I'm hyper aware of those kinds of things because it's so ingrained, but I think it's newer to higher ed. I think in the past, those students wouldn't be in college. Those students wouldn't be qualified college students as far as instructors would say. And so we have a whole new world of students coming to us, and different isn't bad. It's just different. And we need to figure out a way to make it work for everybody. And those best practices are usually best practices.
Absolutely. And I think what's interesting is I think a lot of those best practices that have historically been accommodations, what they all boil down to is flexibility.
Yes.
And they boil down to pulling back from the pedagogy of kindness from K to Nile, believing students and believing in them, right? Just because, we have these best practices, I think what's important is to remember that it's not a blanket. It's what works for your student in front of you is what works best.
Yeah. And best practices change.
Yeah.
So if you've been teaching for 20 years and it was best practice 20 years ago, it might not be anymore.
Yeah.
And so it's that constant learning and continuous quality improvement kind of thing. So
absolutely.
So I want to be mindful of our time. It's time for one of those pauses again.
Yeah.
So now that we've thought about some of these equity and accessibility issues, we're wondering what concerns you have regarding the technology that's used in the classroom. What are the current things you're using? What are past things you've used that you're now maybe thinking, it might be time to take a second look at those, like test proctoring software. So go ahead and either put that in the comments or feel free to use the Jamboard. All right, so we're moving on now to our last section and talking about how COVID has changed the way colleges use technology. we've talked a lot about changes that have happened because of COVID and technology, and just because we use it and it's available, should we be using it and those kinds of things. I will tell you, Parker, I don't know about you, but if I never hear the words unprecedented or the new normal again, I will be the happiest person in the world because it's now precedented. It is now what
Yeah.
it is, right? It's not
Yeah.
unprecedented anymore. It's not the new normal. It's just normal.
Mm-hmm.
This is the world we're living in now. So the article we put in, the transformation of higher education after the COVID disruption, emerging challenges in an online learning scenario. My college has gone from about 20% online classes to about 70% online classes. At the height of the pandemic, when we all shut down, it was everything but pretty much automotive, diesel, and welding. And so now we're looking at how do we start pulling back from that a little bit, and what is it that the students really need? And so the article talked a lot about the rapid pedagogical shift that was required to move us online. We all went through what, in about 2 weeks, we all converted to the online world, and people who
Mm-hmm.
never wanted to teach online were suddenly teaching online. I don't know how your colleagues are feeling, but I'm hearing a lot of, I can't wait to be done with the pandemic and go back to 2019 and how things were. And I think those days are gone. Our enrollment numbers are probably never going to be the same again.
Mm-hmm.
The way students expect to learn and be taught, I don't think we're going back to those days. What do you think?
I agree. And if I'm being honest, I don't want to go back to 2019. I think
Me
I'm a
either.
better instructor because of like COVID is awful and has been awful, but it's really forced me to sit down and reassess how I'm teaching online. And a lot of those changes are translating, I think, better into the classroom.
Yeah, I'm hearing those same things from a lot of people, not everybody, and it's a challenge to come out of this. I think we're going to have to do some really careful thinking, especially in regards to the book that we read about the technologies that we implemented so rapidly. We didn't do case studies and analysis and a whole lot of research. We put in a check and chose a product in weeks, to the needs of this online environment. And now what do we do with those? Do we keep them? Are there ones that we need to reassess? I'm afraid that we're just going to hang on to them because we bought them, and
Mm,
and now they've become kind of part of the world. So and
yeah.
we talked a little bit about Zoom and positives and negatives. And I don't know if your college had this, but we had the whole debate about cameras on versus cameras off. And can
Yep.
we expect that from students? And the first response was everybody keeps their cameras on. I can't do this without the cameras on. I'm talking to black screens. I hate it.
Right.
But then we started talking about equity and
Mm-hmm.
justice and socioeconomic status. And then people started saying, now what? And there were a lot of now what kind of questions. And so I think we really now have to take maybe even using like that digital assessment tool that we showed you
Yeah.
and say, okay, X proctoring software, which I'm not going to name, who's running this? Who's doing this? How does this algorithm work? What does the research look like on students of color and
Mhm.
students who are not neurotypical? Like how we didn't do our due diligence on that product. And so what do we do now?
Mm.
So I'm wondering if you've had experience with some tools that you loved and you're going to carry forward, or maybe you had to use and you went, I hope that one dies a quick death.
So there's a couple things that come to mind, and I think when it comes to Zoom in particular, I've loved that NLU very quickly sort of made the suggestion that even if we have a 3-hour class, that we limit our time on Zoom to, I believe it's an hour and a half, and that has
It's a great idea.
it's helped a lot and I love it. And what that's meant is transitioning into micro lectures. And even before that, we were always encouraged to try and keep lecturing to 30 minutes or less. But the way that I sort of ended doing it on Zoom during COVID, just for engagement and to keep people awake and interested, was instead of doing lecture discussion, I would do 5 minutes discussion, 5 minutes discussion. And so it fills the time, but it's so much more interactive. And my lecturing has just changed so much to the point where I'm not lecturing in the way that we normally think of lecturing. And that's continued into on the ground in person teaching. And I love that. Figuring out the line between where is this useful and where is this tool too much, right? The other thing is before COVID, we used D2L and there's an announcement system.
Mhm.
I've rarely used it. I would use it as a space to put resources that students had asked about, or, maybe we talked about something that was a little bit off topic but still related to the course. And I would throw in some things for students afterward, but I didn't really use it beyond that. Whereas now I think because with just pandemic fatigue and with the amount of work that just goes into working from home, which is way more than when you're not, I recognize that my own ability to keep track of my schedule was diminishing throughout the pandemic. And so I've used it to every morning before class, I have an announcement that's scheduled that says, here's what you need today and for the rest of the week. And I've got our Zoom link, I've got a link to lecture slides, but then I also have the link to whatever activity we're doing, right? If we're using Google Docs or Jamboard or something else today.
Writing this down, can you see?
Yeah. And then I'll have, and here's what you need for this week. And that's where I will link to their assignment, their discussions, their notes, anything I want them paying attention to within the shell further, like their reading list for the week, things like that. So I've started doing that. And the thing that I've started doing in addition to that is I'm using the announcement to say, hey, don't forget I have office hours today, because they forget I have office hours today. And this is something I schedule at the beginning of the term. I just schedule all these announcements to go. I still do additional ones, but beyond that, I think I will probably continue not the tech of Zoom, but the strategies that I use to sort of change the way that I'm doing instruction because of Zoom being limiting.
I'm wondering about your announcements. It's a little off topic, but we're doing a lot of work on student self-efficacy. We message to students that you can do this, that you can finish this, that I'm available. And it sounds like some of that is probably in your announcements as well. Like you've got this, like in the results and the research on just simple statements like, I'm here for you.
Yeah.
I know you're going to be successful. You can do it.
Yep.
Are amazing. And I think announcements in D2L are a great place to do that. But I don't know that my faculty use things pre-scheduled. So I think that's a great tool that I can
it's
share
my
with
favorite because knowing me, I will forget to do it until 2 minutes before class. So my flow is when I'm doing lecture prep and I finish up, I export PDF because that's got to go on D2L, and that's when I'll do the announcement.
That's a really great tool. There's so much we could talk about, but we're almost out of time, or probably beyond out of time. A reflection pause. So as noted by the editors in the intro to this book, CDP is even more pertinent in a world marked by COVID. Think about and reflect, how has COVID altered your experience of the classroom, probably both as a student and as an instructor? How has it altered your work? How has it altered the way you learn? And what are some ways in which you have or will in the future think about implementing CDP in your work? And I'm going to just put in a pitch. This is a book you should own if you at all can. It is one of those books that I think you will want to share with people. The fact that they're individual articles, I think, makes it very user-friendly to a lot of different groups of people. And I know Parker and I both said, yeah, we had to have that one. That was one we wanted to invest in for the shelf.
And I want to add that, well, yes, absolutely. If you can, definitely get the hard copy. It's amazing. But if you can't, if you are limited on funds, it is available on a website that houses all of these individually. We've also linked in the description of this video a specific link to the chapters that we are pulling from for this podcast. And so they have a sort of donate as you are able model for those of you who would like to access it digitally.
Isn't that exactly who this book is?
Yeah.
Right, that they would make sure that it's available and accessible for anyone who would like to get it, whether they can afford to buy a hard copy or not. So I thought it was very on brand.
Yes.
For their message of kindness, just supporting everyone in the work that they're doing. So,
well, thank you so much, Barbara. This has been a lot of fun. This has been a great opportunity. I've loved chatting about this with you.
Yeah, it's been very enjoyable. I told Parker at the beginning I was a little nervous, but once you just start having a conversation, you just start having conversations. And I hope everybody has enjoyed this. I hope you get a chance to look at some of the chapters in the book and really be reflective of what we can be doing and what we should be doing.
All right. Well, thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, or middle of the night if you're a doctoral student like us.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.